Hello viewers and welcome to another card evaluation video in the Lord of the Rings The Card Game Progression series. My name is Mitch.
And my name is Matthew.
And today, now that the Redhorn Gate has officially introduced us to the Secrecy keyword, let's take a look at the player cards included within the second adventure pack of the Dwarrowdelf cycle, Road to Rivendell. Last episode, we made the acquaintance of the defensive Noldor Ranger hero, Elrohir, but now, Matthew, please reveal his offense-focused counterpart.
Alright, so this adventure pack gives us a tactics hero, Elladan. He has a threat cost of 10, 2 willpower, 1 attack, 2 defense strength, and 4 hit points. He is Noldor, Noble, and Ranger, and while Elrohir is in play, Elladan gets plus 2 attack strength. Response: after Elladan is declared as an attacker, pay 1 resource from his resource pool to ready him. So a couple of things. We finally solved the mystery of who is Elladan. So we have the brother here to pair with Elrohir, making both of them a bit better. 2 willpower, strength, and tactics is nothing to sneeze at, although you probably don't want to quest with this guy if you can help it, because the 3 attack strength is pretty decent. He's okay. I think the general community consensus is that Elrohir is better, because in many cases you get more use out of multiple defenses and then readying him again to attack than with multiple attacks. But certainly, if you're using one, you're going to want to use the other, or if you're playing multiplayer, have someone be using the other. So, I think he is fine. But what do you think?
Well, I would certainly recommend using them as a duo. As nice as a potentially unlimited number of attacks is, I would prefer my characters to do so with more than 1 attack strength. Personally, I do prefer Elrohir. My biggest concern when trying to figure out how to beat a scenario is generally, how do I overcome treacheries, and then how do I deal with enemies attacking me? First and foremost, I have to focus on defense, and then I'll worry about offense as an afterthought. So Elrohir can defend, he can ready, he can attack. Elladan, if he defends, then you're not going to be able to attack with him. He's an interesting kind of mixed bag of a hero just because his stats they're not bad, but they're also all over the place. They're not exactly, focused on offense. You mentioned his willpower, which is nice. It's good to be flexible. Willpower in tactics is always welcome. Sort of. It all equates to some wasted threat. He can defend okay in a pinch, but then you're spending attribute points to create a stronger character, and that has the downside, the penalty, the drawback of increasing his threat cost. So if his willpower were lower, if his hit points, his defense were lower, that would make him a more affordable character. And it's cool that he can potentially attack and kill multiple enemies, but it's a little tricky for elves to get really significant attack strength. And when you and I are playing primarily 2-player games, it's not that often he would have the opportunity to attack multiple targets.
Yeah, certainly at this point in the game, it's more difficult for elves more generally, or Noldor specifically, to attack better. There is an attachment we'll talk about here. There are future attachments that will make him better. I think perhaps the biggest drawback, though, of multiple attacks is that he's not ranged. And to be fair, and I don't recall if we mentioned this last time, I'm sure we did, but Elrohir isn't Sentinel either. Both would be better if they had those traits. Now, there are ways to give Sentinel. There are the Dunedain attachments. There will be a bow in the future that grants ranged and stuff. It just kind of sucks that it doesn't come built in, but then maybe that was a balancing choice, I suppose, to not make them way overpowered, but certainly I'd almost rather just have a ranged character with built-in 3 attack that I'm using as my hero, and find other ways to ready, maybe Unexpected Courage or what have you. But I'm not down on the brothers hardcore. Lots of players liked them, particularly at the time they wanted a deck build, but I also don't think they're particularly special either. And in a universe where tactics resources are often sparse, being able to afford readying him is going to be quite problematic.
Yeah, often enough we struggle to, save the life of a winged guardian. Like, resources are that hard to come by, so unless you're dumping Steward of Gondor or something onto a tactics hero or a hero, I guess it has to be specifically from his resource pool is another limiting factor. It can't just be like, Aragorn with Song of Battle or something on him. This can be pretty tricky to pull off. He gets way better with ranged. Elrohir gets way better with Sentinel, and in a 3 or 4 player game, certainly you'll have plenty of opportunities to attack and defend, so they can be very cool. Last time I mentioned that we've seen ally versions of Elladan and Elrohir, so I love the fact that you can kind of mix and match. He's probably a lot less likely than Elrohir to be the failing part of that combo, like Elladan is less likely to die than his brother, and anything you can do to boost up his attack strength is great. There aren't a ton of ways, like you said, we do see more in time, but for the time being, Dunedain Mark can give +1, Dwarven Axe, even though he's Noldor, can still give +1, and then last time we talked about Unseen Strike, and provided that you can keep your threat lower than the engagement cost of the enemy that you're attacking, that's a flat +3 attack bonus that does persist until the end of the phase. So even if you're only just boosting his attack value temporarily, you can get quite a lot of bang for your buck, and I'm just curious to see what eventually comes of this hero. One thing I was kind of curious about, Matthew, because I know that once upon a time, at least, you played with these brothers quite a lot, is do you feel like they're at all Secrecy friendly? I remember a lot of people back in the day were kind of thinking, okay, Elladan is 10, Elrohir is 10, 20 is the Secrecy threshold, there's lots of action advantage between the two.
Right.
Does that strike you as viable at all?
I don't think Secrecy as a mechanic is viable, quite frankly.
Spoilers!
But I know. Well, to be fair, at the end of the cycle, I think that was most people's perceptions. One thing I'll say about the current design team is they have introduced more Secrecy stuff later on. We don't get it immediately after this cycle, but we do get a bit more, so maybe we can revisit your question in the future. But I would say the two brothers in and of themselves, by turn 2, you are no longer in Secrecy range. So unless you draw into, in your starting hand, all those potent Secrecy cards you want, what the hell's the point?
Yeah.
There isn't a bevy of threat reduction in tactics or leadership at this point in the game. So these would not be the two heroes that I would try to build a Secrecy deck with, although to be fair, I've never built one because it's just gimmicky to me. So, yeah, I think the short answer from my perspective is no, but trying to not be so biased against Secrecy, I'm not sure you want to start at 20. Again, the problem is at this point in the game, without all those fun Hobbit heroes we're going to get relatively soon, there's not an easy way to really be below 20 in any synergistic way, whereas the brothers, of course, are natural synergy between heroes. So, long story short, I don't know this is the way to go about it. Whether or not the mechanic is good by the end of the cycle, I think we can revisit in a cycle wrap-up. But again, short answer, no.
Yeah. But no matter how you look at it, I think Elladan and Elrohir are a cool pair of heroes, particularly multiplayer friendly. And whether or not you and I use them a lot, if you're a 3 or 4 person play group or team of players, whatever, certainly give them a look, and as always, share your own thoughts with Matthew and I in the comments. But that's a lot to say about just one card, and there are a few more to cover
really
in this adventure pack. So, what's next, Matthew? What do we see in leadership?
All right. So in our leadership cards, first up is an ally, the Dunedain Wanderer. Costs 5 resources, 1 willpower, 2 attack, 2 defense strength, and 2 hit points. The Dunedain Wanderer is Dunedain and Ranger, and has ranged, Sentinel, and Secrecy 3. So, provided you are in the secrecy threshold, he only costs 2. And for the stats and the range and sentinel, cost of 2 is quite a bargain. I like the art here, I'll mention that. And I know mentioning art on a podcast is always something you should do. So, I think he's really cool. The problem is, I don't think he's worth it in a non-secrecy deck. He's way expensive. So even though Dunedain becomes a fleshed out trait a couple cycles in the future, I don't think that he naturally fits in there. The Dunedain in general don't naturally fit secrecy. They often have a lot of high threat heroes. So I think it's a really cool card. I think he's really good if you are indeed in secrecy. But I'm not so sure I want to pay 5 resources for those stats minus an ability. You can get ranged or sentinel for cheaper with probably equal attack or defense strength, if not better. I'm thinking vassal or winged guardian. Of course, those disappear. This guy doesn't necessarily. So I really actually like the card a lot. I think it's cool. But you know, I think its real place is, for the most part, only within a secrecy deck.
Yes, and that is the problem with a lot of these cards, is Matthew and I are probably going to say in a secrecy deck, this is good, but you have to feel compelled to create a secrecy deck in the first place. Ideally, players are going to get a lot of reward for taking the risk of starting the game with just 2 or, God forbid, only 1 hero. If you're only paying 2 resources for 2 attack, 2 defense, 2 hit points, and a drop of willpower that kind of outperforms all leadership allies we've seen so far, and it gets even better if you're playing multiplayer, considering that it's got ranged and sentinel keywords associated with it. If you're playing a Journey to Rosgobel, you're going to be able to shoot those birds and bats out of the air a little bit more easily, and certainly this is more favorable to something like Guard of the Citadel, where you're paying a couple of resources for just a paltry attack value of 1 and just 2 hit points with no defense to speak of. But the problem here is that you're risking, if you shift out of secrecy even for a moment, and then you're drawing these cards that cost 5 for 1 willpower or a couple attack, that just seems totally unacceptable. I guess in some universe, maybe you're getting 4 or 5 resources a turn thanks to Steward of Gondor and your other heroes. And if you're only drawing 1 card, I guess it's fine if you can pay for this the hard way. But, Gandalf also costs 5, and he's going to make a serious difference immediately. Last adventure pack, we saw a card called Taking Initiative, where you discard the top card of your deck to see if that card has an effect. And if the printed cost of that discarded card is higher or equal to the number of characters you control, then you can draw cards and deal damage. And in that case, it's great that these secrecy cards have a high printed cost, like, 5 is high. But at the same time, it just seems like, God, outside of secrecy, this card really kind of stinks. As much as I like Haldir, I don't know if you and I have played him in our series.
Yeah.
And gosh, I've never put this guy in a deck. It's just so expensive for what you're getting.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever seen him in a deck when I play with my local play group. I don't remember, but I don't think so. Part of me wants to enter into an alternate universe in which this card cost 4 and was secrecy 2. I think if he only costed 4, it might be a card, particularly if you were lacking for ranged or sentinel or something, that you would put into a deck, because 4 might be a little bit more reasonable. Northern Tracker costs 4. Of course, it's got a way stellar ability. But the guy's stats aren't bad. Being able to put 2 attack power anywhere on the table to help out your buddies is great. I mean, it's nothing to sneeze at. And even Sentinel, he could defend some minor enemies. And so I think at a cost of 4, it would be debatable to put in a deck. I still don't think it would make a lot of decks. And his secrecy value, if he was secrecy 2, it would still keep his cost at 2. I think still reasonable for a secrecy deck. But that cost of 5, you're right, is cost prohibitive. And even with cards in the future that you exhaust characters and you get to put a very good tale is what I'm alluding to here, where you can use their cost to get other characters for free. I mean, that would be awesome, but you got to pay for them in the first place. So what I will say is that secrecy is easier and easier and easier to maintain as the card pool expands, because there are more and more and more ways to lower your threat. And if that's the case, then again, I think this guy is good. I mean, I like him just for the art, and I don't say that very often. I think it's just so different than most images we get in the game that I like it on that level probably more than anything. But yeah, I largely agree that it's sort of dead on arrival and hasn't gotten better, even with more ways to lower your threat, and even with Dunedain synergy.
Yeah, I guess just because we've mentioned it a couple of times, for anyone that's just listening to maybe the audio-only version of this, it's a nice little depiction of a Dunedain ranger skinning a deer is what it looks like. Yeah. So it's nice and visceral, kind of a more brutal side of Middle-earth than we normally see, that doesn't involve just cleaving the head off of an orc. What I do like is in a multiplayer game, if just one player is going for maybe secrecy and the other player is not, they're going to be engaging with enemies, and if you can play ranged and sentinel allies, then you're going to be able to help them out, as opposed to just being the player that requires all the assistance. Like if you're relying on a lot of external threat reduction to maintain the secrecy threshold, and I have to attribute thanks to Matthew for giving me that perspective from our original Road to Rivendell review 5 or so years ago, because that's certainly not something I thought of myself, but this is emblematic of leadership in that it's really kind of another versatile jack-of-all-trades ally, but if you want to get the most bang for your buck, again, a couple of resources will buy you a Veteran Axe Hand, which with Dane can swing for 3, Vassal of the Windlord is a bargain as well, and you already mentioned Winged Guardian, which has double the defensive value. So this is an interesting card. The more ranged, the merrier in certain decks, but I'm not exactly rushing out to play this one. But it's always cool to get a card just jam-packed with keywords, and in the future, there are going to be plenty of opportunities to kind of exploit that cost. The last thing I want to end on saying is some people will try to excuse cards that are a little bit more expensive than they warrant by saying, well, if you use Timely Aid, you can cheat it into play for free, or eventually we get cards where it's like, just put the top card of your deck directly into play. And if that's the case, this could be Bjorn or something. Just because it's expensive doesn't mean that it's good. Just not a big fan of this card, but I can't really think of anything else to say about it.
Well, let's move on and see if the next card redeems the leadership sphere. It is the 3-cost event Lure of Moria. Short and sweet, action, ready all dwarf characters. Well, if you're playing a dwarf deck, this is pretty good. It's leadership, so if you're using Steward of Dwarfdor, it's pretty cost-effective. I like it. It readies everyone's characters, not just your own. It's not limited to a certain phase of the game, like planning action, which would be dumb, or, a quest action or something. 3 isn't cheap, but it's also not all that expensive. So, again, particularly in a leadership deck that's usually flush with resources. So, I almost want to say auto-include.
Yeah, not only are leadership decks kind of flush with resources, but when I sit down and design a dwarf deck at this point in the card pool, Dane Ironfoot is a staple, and then the other leadership cards are kind of few and far between. Campfire Tales is nice, I guess, but it's not as if we've got any must-include dwarf allies in the leadership sphere at the moment, unless you count like Longbeard Orc Slayer, and that's still not great for every scenario. So this seems like if you're playing dwarves, you're playing Dane. Dane is leadership, so you may as well include Lure of Moria. Not a lot of players run Grim Resolve, which is ready all characters for the cost of 5, but this is 3, and 3 is way more acceptable. It's a much more realistic upper cost limit for cards. Just like we don't normally play anything with the cost of Dunedain Wanderer, Lure of Moria is much more likely to actually see play, and Ready All Dwarf characters can mean a whole hell of a lot. It can be commit every single character to the quest, and then once you reveal all your encounter cards and you get a bunch of enemies and you know that you have to deal with a big nasty scary combat situation, then you play Lure of Moria. If you don't need it, then you can just commit a metric ton of willpower to the quest. You can even commit Dane Ironfoot to the quest, and he remains committed until the end of the phase, and if you ready him, all of a sudden, prior to quest resolution, he and every other dwarf are still getting that +1 willpower bonus. You can ready all dwarves so that they don't get blown apart by dark and dreadful. You can do multiple attacks, multiple defenses. Dwarves that have activated abilities that require exhaustion you can use. This is just stellar, and I guess before I kind of finish my thoughts, anything else you'd like to mention, Matthew?
Again, it's short, sweet, to the point. It probably belongs in every dwarf deck.
Yeah, it's just nuts. Really, the only other things I have to mention that I can think of are like Sigil Miner. Maybe it can quest and attempt to gain you some resources. Erebor Record Keeper can ready a Sigil Miner, and then you can ready both of them, and you can do that same trick again. You can use Ancestral Knowledge, that lore event that allows dwarves to put progress tokens on locations. So it's just great, and in our Redhorn Gate video, we use that Untroubled by Darkness, and this is just added insurance. If your giant quest push, for whatever reason, does not succeed, then, just kind of stand all your characters and clear out whatever enemies oppose you. Glowin can take a hit and generate maybe 3 resources, and then you play this card, you ready all dwarves, and then you swing back and destroy some giant nasty troll or something. So this is an incredible card. I'm a diehard dwarf fan, so I would kind of recommend picking up this AP for this card alone, but stellar stuff, and let's hope that the other spheres get something half so compelling included.
Well, let's take a look at what Tactics has in store for us. Up first is a 1-cost attachment, Rivendell Blade. It is an item and a weapon. It has to attach to a Noldor or Sylvan character, and it is restricted. When attached character attacks an enemy, that enemy gets -2 defense strength until the end of the phase. This was a bomb when it arrived. It's a bomb today. Bomb in a good way. Fantastic card. It has never lost its value. This is probably the reason to pick up the adventure pack, if I do say so myself. Fantastic card. And I love that it says character. It doesn't say hero. So this can go on allies. Which, when this card first came out, there weren't a lot of allies that were really worth putting this on. But today there certainly are. And in fact, the deck that I was using last weekend, this went on an ally. And it was only intended for a certain ally that I had in my deck. So, a fantastic card. Again, it's never lost its value. The only drawback, is, I suppose, is if an enemy doesn't have defense strength, or 0 defense, 1 defense, then you're losing out here where adding attack would be better. But in most cases, you're going to have 2 or more defense on some enemies that you're trying to kill. And so such a great card. I really, really like it. It is a staple of a Tactics deck that includes Noldor or Sylvan. It is really, really good.
Yeah, it's extremely cool. Elladan is Noldor, so he can wield this, and he's attacking for 3, and then all of a sudden maybe his target has 2 fewer points of defense. You can dual wield these Rivendell Blades and subtract 4 defense. you happen to mention the drawback, and it's kind of the only thing that I can think of that's a negative about this, is you hit the point of diminishing returns with minus to defense strength faster than you do with plus 2 attack strength. So whereas dwarves are all about, hitting brutishly hard, elves are a bit more cunning, refined, and strike with more finesse. So they kind of sap the defense of whatever they're attacking. Most enemies worth bothering to, fret about have 2 or more defense, but for enemies that have 4 or more defense, all of a sudden they're kind of getting few and far between. For example, for the cost of 1 resource, Rivendell Blade cuts 2 defense. For the cost of 2 resources, Dwarven Axe can give a dwarf 2 attack strength. So there's already a bit of a price discrepancy. Dwarrowdelf Axe deals a damage and adds a point of attack strength for the same cost as Rivendell Blade. But if you're doing the dual wield Rivendell Blade thing, something like a Hill Troll has a ton of HP, 9, but it's only got 3 defense. So you're not getting the full effect from these cards. But that minus to defense does persist until the end of the phase. I'll kind of close out our talk about this card by discussing some kind of clever tricks you can do to exploit that persistent debuff effect. But with ranged characters, this is awesome. Restricted is a very minor drawback, and you happen to mention, allies, so Silverlode Archer, this is great on, but even something kind of goofy like Lorien Guide or Hinnemarth Riversong or even a Daughter of the Nimrodel in the right situation can be superb. And then, of course, cards like Haldir of Lorien are perfect with this as well. So it's pretty cool stuff. I'm sure you'll probably see it plenty throughout our series. Any other thoughts before I kind of talk about some goofy uses here?
Well, it's cheap. I like it. You'll see it in my decks.
Yeah, so some final thoughts on the Rivendell Blade are that because that -2 defense does last until the end of the phase, you can potentially allow multiple players to benefit from that effect. Most obviously, a bunch of characters could pool their ranged attacks together and you could benefit from that -2 defense one time, but eventually we're going to be seeing enemies that count as being engaged with every player. So if Matthew doesn't have any ranged characters, but he's got Rivendell Blades and he attacks an enemy, he decreases its defense strength, he deals it some damage, and then if I have an opportunity to attack as well, I can benefit from that defense reduction as well. And maybe I can chip away some HP, whereas I otherwise wouldn't be able to penetrate some insurmountable defense value. Like the Witch King, has a 6 defense. Maybe under normal circumstances I couldn't crack it, but maybe thanks to Rivendell Blade I could. But again, it's pretty seldom that you run into these enemies that do count as being engaged with every player. One of them we will see at the end of the Dwarrowdelf cycle. But if you can maybe change what player an enemy is engaged with, you can do the same thing. Like maybe I attack, I sap away the defense, and then when it comes time for Matthew to attack, maybe he does sneak attack with Son of Arnor, and he pulls the enemy to be engaged with him. It still has that defense penalty, and then he can chip away at it himself. We've mentioned with ranged characters, they can not only participate in attacks against enemies, but then they can also declare their own attack. So let's say I've got a copy of Legolas or Bran, Son of Bane, a ranged character that has unexpected courage. Matthew attacks his enemy, whittles away its defense strength. I participate in that attack and I add my attack value. Then I can use that readying effect like unexpected courage, grim resolve, whatever, Lure of Moria, to ready my character, and then I can launch my own ranged attack and, again, get the benefit of that defense reduction. And then last but not least, I've got to once again give credit to Ian from Tales from the Cards, the incredibly popular LOTR LCG blog, for thinking of the combo using a light in the dark. So once you've decreased that defense strength, you can push the enemy into the staging area, and then Dune here can launch his own little assault. So some of those are pretty corner case situational, unlikely uses, but it really is fantastic food for thought, kind of inspiring creativity with how you can get just the utmost use out of any of these cards. So really cool stuff, and apart from a couple minor drawbacks, this is just a top-notch, top-shelf card here, so certainly comes highly recommended from me.
Well, it doesn't surprise me that one of my top 3 favorite co-hosts on The Great Company would have come up with such a corner case use. But, anywho, I mentioned cheap and I love it for Rivendell Blade, and the next card is also cheap and I hate it. It is the 1-cost event, Hail of Stones. Action, exhaust X characters to deal X damage to an enemy in the staging area. Neat art, orcs getting pelted with stones, but my god, what a horrible card. This would perhaps be better if it was free, and I only say that because to get any significant value out of this, you have to exhaust quite a few characters. Now, certainly, if Thalon is, softening people up, that's a natural combo for Thalon, a hero that I really do love. So, maybe if it's a 2 hit point enemy, you exhaust, Thalon's put 1 damage on him, you pay 1 and exhaust maybe an eagle you weren't going to use anyway, because a lot of them disappear once you use them, Vassal and Winged Guardian, of course. So it's a way to save them in a way, yet still get some damage done. That's kind of cool. You could do it during planning, so before questing, to get rid of some threat in the staging area that tactics otherwise can't contribute. I don't think I've seen anybody use this card. I don't know if we used it in our previous iteration of the Progression series. You would have to refresh my memory there. Yeah. So it's interesting in theory. It certainly would be good in a deck that can pump out a bunch of cheap allies. So certainly, your Snowborn Scouts that have already had their use, they pop the progress on, and then they're not doing a whole lot. Well, hey, exhaust them. Put some damage on something. And there's a lot of other cards like that, where they have an enter play effect, and then they kind of just sit around, and you're not using them for a whole lot, except for maybe chump blocking. So this makes them a bit more versatile. So in that sense, I think it's good, but generally speaking, I don't want to be drawing into this card to get me out of a mess. I'd rather just have higher attack power or better defense strength to deal with those enemies. It's a little bit more conservative, a little bit more reliable. Certainly, I bet it's fun to play this card, where you you exhaust a couple dudes and nuke something in the staging area. I'm sure that's very satisfying, but it requires having a lot of dudes, or a certain number, and then paying 1 resource. So I do think the card is cool, probably worth revisiting in the modern card pool, where it's a lot easier to have resources in tactics, but also have more guys on your side. But at this point in the game, and I just don't think it's one of those cards that sees a lot of play, even though it probably is super fun.
Yes, so I will say there's a lot to like about this card in theory, but when it comes to actually executing that, it's a little bit trickier than one might think. So the cost isn't insignificant, even though it is just 1. So it's cheap, but it's not free, like you said, and that can be prohibitive. I like that you can use any characters, so you can use allies, you can use heroes, you can even use objective allies to contribute to potentially dealing an unlimited amount of damage. But you're kind of in this crappy situation where you always want to be committing characters to the quest in a lot of decks. Tactics, it's less of a priority, and this is a tactics card, so maybe you've got a bunch of characters held back that are ready, anticipating that they're going to have to defend and or attack later in the round. I like that as an action, you can play this after staging, but prior to quest resolution. So if it just so happens that you've got some really high defense, low HP enemy, maybe you can spend some characters that would have died defending to instead instead exhaust, you play this event, and then you pick off the enemies as opposed to having to use a ton of actions, sacrificing allies. Maybe this is a nice way to get around something. Or maybe you're playing a scenario where you've got like goblin archers or goblin snipers that don't let you engage them in a conventional sense. So they just sit there in the staging area kind of harassing and molesting you. That is a great opportunity to kind of kill those where you normally otherwise couldn't. And this is also a cool opportunity to deal with enemies like the Orc Drummer. And that specific card is incredibly nasty because even though it doesn't have very high HP, it gives each enemy plus X threat, where X is equal to the number of players. Later on, in future adventure pack cycles, some of the most frustrating encounter cards are going to be these enemies that dramatically increase the amount of threat in the staging area while they're sitting in there. So if you can pick those off kind of before they become a problem, then that's fantastic. But kind of the issue here is it doesn't prevent when revealed effects. It might not be enough to outright destroy enemies, and kind of for that reason, it's cool in theory, but I'm not necessarily super likely to throw this into decks. As much as I love direct damage, you've really got to know your scenario to say, like, okay, yes, there are a couple of 2 or 3 hit point enemies that do pose a huge issue in this scenario that I could really benefit from destroying, or no, it's not worth including Hail of Stones in this deck just because the enemies that I'm really worried about, when revealed, automatically attack a player or something, and once that when revealed effect is done, they've kind of already served their purpose in posing whatever detriment to you. So this is a cool card. You can combine it with those global readying effects to, say, commit all the characters on the board to the quest, and then play Grim Resolve to ready them, and then pelt and destroy whatever enemies oppose you. But you do need a lot of characters in some instances, and unless you can kind of artificially change the number of characters, like our first spirit ally is going to be a character that can move from player to player. Wandering Took can do the same thing. So this is it's a cool card. I certainly wouldn't scoff at anyone that uses it, but I do hesitate to put this in most decks.
All right, well, let's see what Spirit throws our way. Up front is a 3-cost ally, Rider of the Mark. It has 2 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense strength, 2 hit points. It is Rohan. Action, spend 1 spirit resource to give control of Rider of the Mark to another player, limit once per round. Response, after Rider of the Mark changes control, discard a shadow card dealt to an enemy you are engaged with. Honestly, this card gives me PTSD. And flashbacks to a horrible Progression Series video of old. I'm not sure what to say about this character.
My bad on that one.
Yeah, you're bad. If you haven't watched the entirety of the old Progression Series, in one of the Hobbit boxes when we were dealing with Smog, this was like our clutch strategy, and somebody forgot to trigger it to spare my heroes getting wiped out by the dragon. Anywho, super neat art. It's this Rohan dude racing on a horse. A little expensive at 3 resources. But getting rid of shadows consistently is kind of cool. Now, granted, it's a gamble. You don't know if the shadow effect does anything or not. But it at least is a way to get rid of them, again, consistently. Whereas Hasty Stroke gets rid of 1, and you're done. You can only have 3 copies in your deck. So I do like it. Rohan comes into its own, I think, much later in the game, although the first cycle had quite a bit of Rohan. So outside of being major Rohan synergy and those sorts of things, I think the real reason to include this is sort of semi-permanent shadow cancellation, even though it's at a risk, because again, you don't know what it does, if it does anything. So I like him. I mean, 2 willpower isn't bad. He could throw in an attack strength point here if necessary. He's decent. Is not a great ally. I think it becomes better later, but certainly not bad.
Yeah, depending on the scenario, sometimes it is completely unacceptable to have shadow cards resolve, or depending on the time in a certain scenario, even in like the core set. I forget if it happened in this PS 2.0, but let's say I'll say something like, the only way that we could possibly lose the scenario right now is if this shadow card is 1 out of 48 chance of being a Hummer Horns, and then all characters in play take 2 damage. If we have a Rider of the Mark that's able to kind of ride to the rescue, we can discard that shadow card without knowing what it is, just to make absolutely certain that we are not destroyed. Matthew alluded to a time when he and I played the Lonely Mountain scenario from the second Hobbit Saga expansion, the On the Doorstep box, and that's an interesting example of when you reveal a shadow card that has a certain characteristic, or doesn't have a certain characteristic where it triggers some sort of effect. Like a Progression Series 2 relevant example would be the Warg enemies, where they return to the staging area if you reveal a shadow card that does not have a shadow effect. If you use Rider of the Mark to take away the possibility of revealing a shadow card, then all of a sudden you guarantee that those wargs do not escape from you, and you're able to destroy them. You don't have to use a hail of stones to pick them off while they're in the staging area. You can just deal with them conventionally, and you don't have to worry about shadow cards that in some cases could give the boss enemy extra attacks. They could result in a chain of revealing additional shadow cards where all of a sudden your super defender that seemed invincible is brought to his or her knees and has his or her head lopped off. And Matthew, you touched on the fact that this is repeatable. Rider of the Mark can ride from player to player, and every turn, provided they can keep spending spirit resources, they can remove those shadow cards. Where I led Matthew astray in our previous video is the wrong character controlled, the wrong player controlled Rider of the Mark. It's, you spend the resource, it changes control, and then the new controller discards a shadow card. If player A controls Rider of the Mark and player A is the one that needs to get rid of a shadow card, then that Rider isn't going to be able to do any good because that action is a limit once per round. So at this point, 3 cost for 2 willpower is still acceptable. We've yet to hit that dream ideal world I would like to live in, where it's 2 cost for 2 willpower, and the stats apart from that aren't exactly anything to write home about, but it's a cool card. There's a little bit of developing Rohan synergy in the form of Eamond readying characters. Mustering the Rohirrim can help you dig for this guy. We do not sleep, astonishing speed. You can even use scrying effects to guarantee that your spirit resource isn't wasted, in that you can at least figure out what the very top card of the encounter deck is. But certainly, since I'm biased toward multiplayer, I'll just happen to say that Rider of the Mark doesn't do a whole lot of good in a single player environment.
All right, the second spirit card of this adventure pack is a 1-cost attachment, Song of Eärendil. It is a song. It has to attach to a spirit hero. Response: after Song of Eärendil enters play, draw 1 card. Second response: after another player raises his threat, raise your threat by 1 to reduce that player's threat by 1. Interesting card. I've not seen it used a lot, but certainly it's a way to help another player's threat not get out of control. And certainly, since Spirit is the sphere at this point in the game that can control its threat the best, it's a way to sort of keep one player stuck at a certain threshold. And then the other player is going up more, but they can hopefully reduce it through a variety of means. So it's interesting. I don't know that this is great. It's certainly almost exclusively multiplayer, although there are some janky song decks that try to do some fancy things with songs. So I don't know. I don't particularly love it. I like the fact that you could maybe help out. Like maybe there's an enemy that has engagement cost of 33, and you want to keep your partner at 32 for a while. You could, as long as you don't yourself hit the 33. So interesting. Again, I just don't know that it's a card that I'm going to want to draw into. Like, oh yes, this will save our butts. Maybe in some cases, but a lot of cases you're just gonna be like, meh, okay, well, I can help my buddy with this threat. Great. And it's not really helping you progress against the encounter deck. So, I don't know. Not my fave.
Yeah, I think interesting but not great sums up how I feel about most cards in most card games. Yeah. But this can offer some really cool control elements that you kind of alluded to. This game is kind of built around thresholds, like Evil Storm does not affect you until you hit threat value 35, and then all of a sudden it's dealing damage to all of your characters, and that pretty much sucks. But if I've got 24 threat and Matthew's got 34, every time something would push him up to that dangerous 35 threat threshold, I can at least boost up my threat by 1 point to decrease his threat by 1 point. So every refresh phase, Matthew and I boost our threat up by 1. I boost my threat up by an additional 1 to decrease his threat by 1. So I gain net 2, he gains net 0. After this enters play, you draw a card. So without just using slang, colloquialisms, assuming everyone knows, generally this kind of thing is called a cantrip, where it's kind of an underwhelming spell effect that you're paying for, but it doesn't really cost you much, and in this case, you're investing a resource, but you're not really using up your card that you've drawn for the turn, because it's immediately replacing itself in your hand. So it's a very kind of slight effect, but it's also a very slight cost. And this can allow you to do some pretty cool things, just because if we reveal an encounter card that's doomed 1, just like during the refresh phase, maybe I gain 2 threat, Matthew gains 0. Maybe we reveal another doomed card, I gain 2, Matthew gains 0. But if you reveal something like doomed 3, maybe I gain 4 and Matthew gains 2. And in that case, you can only use the second response 1 time per threat increase, so this card does have its limitations. What I like a lot about this card is that for certain effects, like Boromir, you can go absolutely crazy, where if Matthew is the player with Boromir, he can attack, ready Boromir, I take the threat gain for him, and then he can use Boromir again. So all of a sudden you can kind of rely on both players' threat reservoirs as an alternative just resource available to the players. So not just cards, not just the resource tokens, but also threat being used as something that you can kind of deplete, or before you hit 50, it doesn't necessarily matter that much what your threat value is. This is a song, so the Rivendell minstrel can fetch it, but kind of the neatest thing you can do with this card is if you can kind of arrange some sort of scenario where you can kind of on demand trigger that response, you can do some really cool stuff. And if you play multiple copies of Song of Eärendil, one on either player, in a 2-player game, you can do some exceedingly cool things. So first and foremost, let's say Matthew and I are each running spirit heroes. I can put a copy on my hero, I can put a copy on Matthew's hero. If that isn't the case, I can use Song of Travel to make one of Matthew's heroes spirit, and then I can play a song on it. And once that's the case, I can use a card like Wandering Took to basically pick and choose what I want our threat totals to be. So Wandering Took is you decrease your threat by 3 to give control of it to another player, and then you raise their threat by 3. If you exchange control of Wandering Took, there's no net threat gain between either player, but each player has gained threat and each player has lost threat, which lets you trigger the second response of Song of Eärendil. And if both players can pick and choose when they want to trigger their respective copies of that song, they can up their threat any number of times to decrease the other player's threat any number of times. So maybe Matthew and I each strategically shift our threat totals under the engagement cost of a specific enemy. Maybe we change our threat totals so that an enemy engages with Matthew and not me. Maybe we make it so that both Matthew and I are able to play secrecy cards during planning, and maybe we ensure that both of us are underneath that evil storm or whatever threshold. So it's certainly a lot of work to get a big combo like that up and operational, but it's things like that that get easier to pull off the more players there are in a game, and just again provides a little bit of food for thought in regard to, like, as our card pool grows and making these combos manifest becomes more and more likely. It's just neat to think about what are my options, even if they're a little tricky. So it's a cool card. It's interesting. I don't exactly foresee myself using it, but cool stuff. And if you're a Pippin style combo player, there's a deceptively large amount of things you can do with it.
All right. Well, lore. We have an ally. Cost 3. It's Bombur. 0 willpower strength, 0 attack strength, 1 defense strength, and thank God, 3 hit points. Bombur is a dwarf. Action. Exhaust Bombur to choose a location. That location gets -1 threat strength until the end of the phase. That location does not contribute its threat strength instead, if it's an underground location. That's pretty decent. I mean, 3 costs for a measly stat line dwarf isn't fantastic, although 3 hit points aren't horrible. But you're basically using him for some threat mitigation. -1 threat for the cost of 3 resources is maybe sort of meant, but again, it's repeatable. He can always do that. It's basically all he's going to do. He can maybe soak up some archery, which hasn't yet appeared in the game later on, but certainly he could do that. If it's underground, and there are underground locations in the game, certainly, it doesn't contribute its threat at all. That's the ideal situation. So, he's a dwarf that doesn't really benefit from Dane, because you're probably not questing or attacking with him. You're using him for his action. I think it's decent. I think he'd be a 1 or 2 of in my deck, but certainly not a 3. What do you think, Mitch?
Well, this is really a card where if someone were to say, what's your opinion of Bombur from Road to Rivendell, I would have to say it depends. So often in this game, we have to build specific to a scenario. If you're anticipating a lot of underground locations, then he can be great. Otherwise, he's kind of trash. 3 lore resources is expensive when you're paying for 4 stat points. It's fantastic if you're playing Khazad Doom and Sigil Mineshaft has 5 threat, and then you're paying those 3 resources to bring 5 to 0. That's absolutely stellar. But if you're just, decreasing the threat value of a location by 1, that's the equivalent of 1 willpower. And if you want 1 willpower, play Erebor Record Keeper. It costs 1 resource but has 2 willpower, so making that kind of comparison, Bombur just seems like garbage. But because I'm not as privy to the modern card pool and modern scenarios as is Matthew and many of the people watching or listening to this video, there end up being a surprisingly large number of underground locations over time. So whereas kind of the latter half of the Dwarrowdelf cycle, we kind of return to Moria, just like we saw in Khazad Doom, there is a resurgence of underground locations. After that cycle, it's quite a long time before a deluxe expansion or adventure packs kind of revisit the deep, dark So it's cool that you can potentially use his ability multiple times, Erebor Record Keeper. Instead of committing that to the quest for 1 or 2 willpower, you could invest a lore resource, use its ability to ready Bombur. Bombur could maybe turn 2 Sigil Mineshafts from 5 threat locations to 0 threat locations. Eventually, we see lots of 3, 4, 5 or more threat underground locations. So it's cool. I definitely would not include him in just any deck. The fact that he's unique is a bit of a bummer, but if you're running Lure of Moria and stuff like that, in the right scenario, he can be pretty superb. Just don't expect him to do anything outside of very specific circumstances.
Alright, so up next for lore is the 3-cost event, Out of the Wild. Has Secrecy 2, an action, search the top 5 cards of the encounter deck for any one non-objective card worth no victory points and add it to your victory display. Shuffle the encounter deck. I actually think this is a pretty decent card. With Secrecy, it only costs 1. If you happen to be a lore player flush with resources, not likely, but possible, I don't even think it's that horrible at cost of 3. Being able to thin the encounter deck of some of its most potent cards is pretty good. So I like this one. And I think of all the Secrecy cards we've seen so far, this is the first that I would debate paying 3 for as a way to sort of manage the encounter deck. So I think it's interesting. I've not really seen people use it, in large part because I've not seen a lot of people do Secrecy decks, but I do enjoy what it's doing, and I think it's certainly a potent effect. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a card that I've not seen a lot myself, but as the game matures, I suppose you could say, it does become all the more powerful because initially encounter decks were huge, something like 50 or so cards. It almost seemed like a total random crapshoot what you were going to be facing. Like, is it going to be the Hummerhorns, which sucks? Is it going to be the Hill Troll, which is actually kind of a nightmare to face? Or is it just going to be softball after softball? Is it going to be Evil Storm whiffing after just, all these kind of ineffectual encounter cards one after another? Or is it going to be like the big nasty thing? 5 cards is actually quite a few to look at, and as encounter decks get smaller and smaller, it becomes more and more likely that you're going to be able to remove the individual elements from the encounter deck that are best suited to beat any player or best suited to deal with your specific deck. Granted, those can't have victory points, but for the most part, the cards Matthew and I worry the most about are treacheries, and so far as I'm aware, I don't know of any treachery cards that have victory points, and certainly some enemies don't have victory points that are still really nasty. Like if you end up killing the Witch King from the Massing Addos Gileath, and then it gets shuffled back into your encounter deck, it's possible that you could just remove that from the game. So this is a kind of neat card. You don't even necessarily have to be playing it blind. In a single-player game, Hinnamarth Riversong is one of the strongest cards there is, because you always know what the next card of the encounter deck is. If it's going to be something that you just are going to be annihilated by, if you're not using Denethor with the option of putting it on the bottom of the encounter deck, you can use this to put it in your victory display, and once it's there, it's basically as good as removed from the game. Really the only downside of this card, apart from the fact that of course it can whiff and of course it can be a little expensive, is if you are using Denethor's ability, if you've used him previously to put nasty encounter cards on the bottom of the deck, this does shuffle the encounter deck, and you might end up distributing those really difficult cards back near the top. It's maybe not the most exhilarating card to draw in the world, but it can be pretty superb, and especially in a multiplayer game where you're very likely to be pulling a ton of encounter cards, and the encounter deck is likely to kind of pull off its encounter combos. If you can dismantle its ability to, if one or more players are running one or more copies of Out of the Wild, this can be incredibly nasty. So it's not necessarily a feel-good card to draw, but when you pull something integral out of the encounter deck, I think it can be a pretty satisfying feeling.
All right, and our final card of this adventure pack is the neutral event that is 0 cost. The End Comes. Response: after a dwarf character leaves play, shuffle the encounter discard pile back into the encounter deck. What? Worst card ever. Stupid, dumb, never going to use it, don't know why it was printed, it's a waste of a tree. This is just horrible. Now, certainly, we have seen instances where, Gollum or something escapes us, and we need to get him back in the encounter deck. Or something's discarded as a shadow. We actually had that, Shadow of the Past, and I think we actually used it in one of our videos. But this is like those cards times 10 in crappiness, because you have to have a dwarf character leave play. And so you have to hope you've got an enemy to kill it, or that there's some other way to get the dwarf to leave. I just don't even get what they were trying to solve with this particular card. The art is neat, and that's about it.
Yeah, I want to say first and foremost, I do not care for this card, and this is one that when it was first introduced, I failed to see any benefit to this whatsoever, and you've really got to dig to be able to come up with anything clever. I spent countless sleepless nights trying to figure out reasonable uses for the End Comes here, and the best I could kind of come up with was something I've deemed like strategic encounter deck dilution, or depletion of the encounter deck discard pile. First of all, a dwarf has to leave play. Generally, I like to play games where I'm not losing characters. That's kind of a sign of things going badly. Unless you're sneak attacking Longbeard Orc Slayer or something like that, there aren't dwarves that have when it leaves play, you get this beneficial effect. So if dwarves are dying, that's bad. And it's also kind of crappy because it prevents you from playing this free card that you might otherwise want to play. Like, what kind of nightmare world would I be in if I want to play The End Comes, but I don't have any enemies to kill my dwarves or something like that. So it's nice that it could be an ally or hero leaving play, but leaving play sucks. At least it's more akin to Prince Imrahil than it is Horn of Gondor, where it's leaves play versus destroyed. But the best use for this card is maybe you can return discarded...
Kindling?
Right. But maybe the best use for this card is being able to return discarded objectives from the discard pile to the encounter deck, just so that you maybe have the chance to draw them again. Or you can return beneficial encounter cards or minimally offensive encounter cards from the discard pile to the encounter deck, like Forest Grove, which can let you find Atheles, or maybe you're just really struggling to overcome passage through Mirkwood, you can get that old forest road again to ready one of your characters after you travel there. You could maybe return copies of Mirkwood Bats or something like that, Eastern Crows, so that Thalin results in additional encounter cards whiffing. But perhaps the strongest use for this card, and I don't think that this is very likely to actually benefit you, is to prevent the encounter deck from triggering effects that key off of discarded encounter cards. For example, in the Massing Eddow's Gileath that Matthew and I played, Wayne Rider Captain is when revealed, you move the top scout enemy from the encounter discard to the staging area. And if you've gotten to the point in that scenario where you cross the Anduin, that's returning 2 enemies into play. So if you can prevent that effect, that's actually pretty good. I don't think it's very likely, statistically speaking, to happen, but it is a cool use. The Road to Rivendell scenario itself has a card called Orc Ambush, where all orc enemies in the staging area engage the first player, but if there aren't any, which generally is the case when I'm playing that, all orc enemies in the discard pile are returned to the staging area. So all of a sudden that's an absurd amount of threat, and then you're unlikely to be able to clear the scenario, and then you are likely to just get swamped and swarmed and just torn to little pieces. So if you can prevent that kind of effect, that's also great. And then really the only other thing I can think of to mention is that eventually, once we open up our Heirs of Numenor Deluxe expansion, for instance, there are encounter cards which are like, for every copy of X treachery in the discard pile, you trigger this effect multiple times. So there are a few occasions when shuffling that discard pile back into the deck can be beneficial, but probably more than 9 times out of 10, this is going to be a waste of a card in your deck. It's going to be a dead draw. You're going to have it in your hand and not going to be able to play it. And it's worth mentioning that just because it costs no resources, it still counts as a card that you're drawing, which can basically be a total waste, and it counts as kind of adding unnecessary volume to your deck. If you're drawing this instead of the absolute gold to get your good combos up and running, then this is absolute trash. So I kind of have to agree with you, Matthew. I don't know if this is going to necessarily keep us cold through the winter, but maybe if we get enough kind-hearted viewers to send in their copies, we'll manage to survive the cold through kindling these. But I can't think of anything else to say about that one. Yuck.
Too much said already.
Yeah.
Garbage.
But overall thoughts on Road to Rivendell as a pack?
Well, I'll try not to let that last card bias me too much. Like so much of the early game, there's some real wins here. To me, the clear winner is Rivendell Blade. Its power remains to this day. Now, Lure of Moria is a good card, and I'm not even sure that that's disputable, but the dwarves have, their time in the sun has sort of faded, and while it's a great card, nobody really plays dwarves anymore. We have much more options. So really, I guess out of the whole pack, there's one card with staying power, Rivendell Blade. The rest are all kind of meh, or corner case, or just super combo-y. So I can't say it's a great pack. It's not one that I would recommend to new players to rush out and buy. Elladan is okay, but even still, Elladan and Eärendil aren't really played all that much today, even though they might be, certainly respectable heroes in their own right. So it's an okay adventure pack to me, certainly not the best.
Yes, I think this is entirely skippable. Even the cards that are best from this adventure pack aren't necessarily for everyone. To provide a little bit of context, Matthew and I are recording this video after the Sands of Harad Deluxe expansion has come out, and we're still making our way slowly through the Harad cycle being released. And at that point, I don't really hear of anyone playing Secrecy decks. Dwarves, like Matthew mentioned, aren't exactly glittering as they used to, and even if they did, not everyone loves the dwarf playstyle. I myself am pretty partial to it, but I certainly cannot speak to everyone. Rivendell Blade is pretty good. Noldor and Sylvan, you're casting a very wide net. So that's a really cool card, but stuff like Hail of Stones in certain scenarios is great, but it's also a playstyle that doesn't necessarily suit everyone, and it's not just a card that you can just splash into any deck. And as much as I am quite flattered by the artist basing the biceps art in that photo after my Facebook pictures, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Hail of Stones. Rider of the Mark, in certain scenarios, when played correctly, can be absolute gold. But again, it can whiff, it's not amazing. And Song of Eärendil, for as much as I respect it, I'm not exactly rushing out to make song decks. And Bombur is totally hit and miss depending on the scenario. Everything else, take it or leave it. I'm not exactly impressed by this adventure pack. So there's stuff that I like, but is this absolutely necessary to get your hands on? No. If you're struggling to finish your LCG collection for LOTR, certainly wait until Rivendell is its MSRP or lower. But that's pretty much all I can think of to say about this one. So unless you've got any final thoughts, Matthew, why don't you toss out your podcast info and let's wrap this one up.
Well, I would be so honored if you would check out the Great Company podcast, where you can join my co-host and I, Dan, Derek, Ian, for an in-depth look at the Lord of the Rings LCG, focusing on strategy, deck building, and the metagame. We are the Great Company podcast.
Definitely give them a listen, as every episode comes very highly personally recommended from me. If you'd like to get in touch with yours truly, I'm the Hive Tyrant on Facebook, on Twitter, really any form of social media. If you'd like to support the ongoing progression series, there's a Patreon setup as well. Please share your own thoughts on any or all of these cards in the comments section below. I think it's fair to say that Matthew and I are lukewarm at best on most of these, so especially if your thoughts differ, let us know why, and it's always fun to hear about play experiences. So, as always, thank you for watching. Next up, we're actually going to be playing through the kind of ambush keyword introducing scenario, Road to Rivendell. Once again, we're going to be joined by guest host Arwen Undomiel. So there's lots to look forward to, much more to come. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, take care, and see you again soon.